There we go.
And we're live.
Okay. Welcome everybody, including to anybody who's online. This is the meeting of the City Efficiency Committee appointed by the City of Salem City Council. We'll call the meeting to order. I'm pretty sure we have our quorum, which is everybody. The great news is we didn't lose anybody from Wednesday, so we're all in still. Do we have to, for quorum rules, we have to say anything about notice having been adequately given or anything like that, or can we just make that assumption?
You can make that assumption.
Okay.
Could, for roll purposes and for the recording, could everyone just go around and say their name?
Ernesto Torres.
Bryce Peterson, Ryan Dempster,
Todd Granito.
Michael Gay.
Eric Frisk,
Keith Staley.
Brian Johnston,
Kathy Gordon
Brian Moore.
Josh Eggleston.
and Kelly Reinbach.
Also want to recognize two members of the public who are with us. If you just want to share your names really quick.
Kara Adamson.
Kara Adamson and
Joe Cease.
Lucy's. Welcome.
Thank you.
I think the first item of business is approval of the minutes or comments on it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so we look for a motion and a second. With a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
All right. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Great, motion passes. Did everyone receive the, Josh sent out some information about ethics in public meetings for groups such as ours. Did everybody receive that? Or I guess if you didn't receive it, maybe let us know. I do want to call your attention to it, and you may not have had time before this meeting to take a look at it, but it's relatively straightforward and probably worth the review. I admit I was a little surprised when I was reviewing it that we fall under some rules that maybe we didn't think we were, not that it mattered, but we're a short-term group and called together fairly quickly, and I might have thought, oh, maybe we're just this kind of ad hoc advisory committee. Well, we are technically a, what's the word?
City official.
City official. So it's good for us to know that, to make sure that we observe all the laws and that we do right by the public and that we don't get ourselves individually or collectively into any trouble. So this is a public meeting. And so like if we, for example, send an email to each other, that's technically a quorum. And any of that would be available to the public. So it's just good to know. I suspect maybe that's, is that part of why when you send something to us, we're not all necessarily, like we can't reply all to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to remove any chance of a serial meeting or violation of public meetings law, we often blind copy members of a committee. If you want to distribute something to the committee, we're happy to do that. So just send it to staff and we can take care of that. It just removes any chance of someone replying and then someone else replying and back and forth. If we just maintain those pretty basic things. And also, I mean, one note, if you don't look at it, just be aware that any emails or work you might do in connection with the committee is technically still a public record. So just be mindful of that.
Any questions from the committee? Okay. Kara, Joe, did you have anything that you wanted to say today? I know Kara, initially you'd said you'd prefer to observe.
Well, now I'd just like to indulge.
Okay. Joe,
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. You bet. Do want to acknowledge there was an additional piece of correspondence from Jim Shepke regarding the Salem Public Library. It's attached to the agenda and Josh had sent it out. Invite you to read that if you have not already. Are there any particular thoughts from the group on that letter from Jim or the two that were presented before the first meeting? One from Jim and one from
Bill Dixon.
Bill Dixon. I had asked Josh if you had any particular response as staff to share. That would now be an appropriate time.
Sure,
Do you have a response?
Let me pull it up and we can just walk through it together if that's helpful.
That'd be great.
Nothing particular back for Jim Shepke. Jim Shepke's a library advocate that we hear from at multiple groups. Generally helpful information, so feel free to review that. I think so Bill Dixon is a member of the budget committee, very engaged. And just kind of walking through a couple of things. The first one there is talking about urban renewal areas. And I will say the city's in the process of evaluating, not the closure, but stop collecting tax increment for a couple of those areas, for Mill Creek and North Gateway specifically, which will contribute additional dollars to the general fund. It won't help fiscal year 2026, but it could help the balance of the forecast period.
It's good to know. Thank you.
Did you agree with the estimate of 5.5 to 6?
It's actually higher.
Oh.
So if you were to close all urban renewal areas, it's more like $7 to $8 million.
Okay.
So it's not an incorrect number. It's just a couple of years old.
Got it.
Workload imbalances. I would say.
Josh, before you move on to the urban renewal areas, we do have Moss Adams doing some performance auditing on our urban renewal area program, and they'll be presenting that to us, like, say, in the next 60 days or so.
Yes, absolutely. So we requested them to complete that work prior to the budget committee process. So hopefully they'll be presenting that to the finance committee in March.
You said in 26, is that because you cannot move it to 25? You cannot stop collecting, or?
That is correct. So with urban renewal areas, you have to satisfy all your debt covenants, all your outstanding contracts. So just with the, we need a little bit more tax increment for the Mill Creek area to satisfy all the outstanding debt, and same for North Gateway. There's also still some projects to be completed, and really quick. So we're not closing the areas; they'll probably still remain open for several years. It's just simply not collecting additional tax increment, which would return, several $1 million back to the city, several $1 million back to the school district, and all the other taxing jurisdictions.
And when you say closing versus opening, what does that mean?
So the area has to remain open while you still have dollars in the fund that can be
So open for money to be spent.
open for money to be spent, but we'll stop collecting additional property taxes for those areas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no new revenue, just finishing out the expenditure cycle.
And we touched on this briefly last time, but the URA, Urban Renewal Agency, is a separate entity, but there is a very direct relationship with the city and other taxing jurisdictions. The board of the URA is the same as the city council, which is why we have a joint budget committee, joint finance committee. We treat a lot of that as a kind of combined management structure.
I didn't realize it was an option to kind of turn off the spigot, but keep the area open.
Yeah, so even like the Fairview urban renewal area, we haven't collected for many years, but it's still technically open because there's still some dollars sitting there waiting to be spent for specific needs, grants, projects.
So we couldn't, well, you can then transfer some of the balance from an urban renewal area back to the general fund, or only turn off the siphoning off of property taxes in the future.
Yeah, so it's a very unique setup. There's lots of regulations around how you work with urban renewal areas. So no, you can't transfer directly from the URA to the city, except for like the provision of services, which we do for some of our staff. If we have leftover dollars in Fund 220, so that's where the tax increment comes in, and the area is already at maximum indebtedness, they can't actually borrow anymore. We actually return those to the county, and then they would redistribute that to the city and all the other taxing jurisdictions.
Okay.
And we'll be doing that for actually McGilchrist. We have some dollars sitting there that we'll be giving back to the county to redistribute.
Thank you.
Sorry for the convoluted answer, but it's
helpful.
It's complicated.
It's a unique structure. So we go back to the ORS and the OARs fairly often.
Yeah, I bet.
Workload imbalances, I won't speak too much on this. I mean, I think you could talk to every department director, and this would be a consistent challenge for departments, is that the workload is in excess of the staff capacity. and continues to be a challenge. We did a deferred staffing needs analysis, and sorry, it's not a very fun name, a few years ago. And, if we were to have maintained, you know, staffing with the population growth we've had the last several decades, we'd have an additional 300 positions on staff. So that's kind of that fiscal constrained environment artificially reducing the staffing.
Which is about where the city of Eugene is right now. They have about 300 more positions than the city of Salem.
So how many of city, what percentage of city employees are overtime eligible?
Good question. I don't have that off the top of my head. I would guess, like 70 or 80% are,
The large
yeah,
percentage.
a large percentage are on, line employees.
So is this correct statement, so that we have a lot of overtime pay? I assume that can accumulate a lot.
So it's
So
a
maybe
very,
we don't have enough people, but we are paying more than if we had enough people.
so it's a nuanced question. It's going to look different for each department. So like the police department has a different overtime situation than the fire department. For the fire department, they have minimum staffing requirements. So if someone calls out sick, they keep someone over and they operate with overtime. The police department might run short. They might choose not to bring someone in. So we see significant overtime for the fire department. They've also been operating a medic unit, the past several years to backfill for Folk. So that's actually ended at this point. We're going to take over that service starting in July. So there's a portion of overtime that's just going to go away because we're not doing that service anymore.
But that overtime for the medic unit was also reimbursed, so we were getting an offsetting revenue. So the expense is bigger, but,
By who, by Medicare?
no, by
The
the
enterprise,
emergency.
by the enterprise fund.
Yeah,
So these people will stay to be firefighters. They will just not do the medical stuff.
So all our firefighters are paramedics. So they were operating the medic unit. So it's actually a higher level employee than you need because you just need a paramedic. You don't need a paramedic firefighter to
Yeah.
operate the ambulance. So when they go and start the service, we've already, I think, offered 60 plus positions. 62. So they're going to be a combination of EMTs and paramedics, but not firefighters. So they'll be a lower cost employee than a firefighter medic
Mhm.
going forward. So no overtime and a lower cost employee. It's going to reduce our
And you
costs.
said they will essentially pay for themselves.
That's our expectation.
Josh, would it be possible to quantify the cost of that overtime?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we just responded to this question for the budget committee. I'm happy to forward that response to this group.
That'd be helpful. Thank you.
Do you remember approximately what was?
I can just pull it up for you.
That would be fine. Unuseful. Okay.
And I'll send this out, so don't feel like you have to take notes. Sorry, this is what we have when we have on the fly information gather. This is all on the,
This is all on the web, maybe inaccessible on the web.
so here's the overtime back to 2014, so 10-year look. And you can see the overtime is largely concentrated for police and fire. And just
8.9 million.
Oh.
Whoa.
And speaking just for the medic unit, so I've offered an alternate adjusted overtime number with the medic unit pulled out. So it was approximately 700,000 in 22, 1.3 in 23, and 2.3 in 2024. So that was a large portion of the fire overtime at that point.
So medic unit saving will be
Significant.
2.3 million.
And it's not necessarily saving, as Callie mentioned, we were getting an offset. So they were reimbursing the general fund for that overtime.
Yeah.
So it's a net zero impact.
Okay.
But we're not expecting to run at
So some of that 8.9 did not come out of the general fund.
correct, yeah. So
So it's really 6.5-ish overtime when we eliminate the medics.
yeah, that's correct. So but still significant.
Yeah.
And it is something that HR, finance, we continually monitor with the police and fire departments. Some of it has to do with maintaining vacancies with potential budget reductions on the horizon. We speak to that in some of the answers for the meeting today. It's also just capacity. So the fire department's bringing on a lot of the ambulance operators. They don't have staffing capacity to run a separate academy to fill their other positions at this point.
Materials you sent out to the committee, thought the budget suggested $1 million decrease in the budget for 2025. That sound familiar? I don't have it in front of me. I don't have my laptop available.
Specific to which?
That overall overtime for the city. I don't know if it's just general fund.
Oh, yeah, good
Is it
question.
in the staff report?
It was, we got several document links. One of them was for 2024 financials, 2023 financials. One was for 2025 budget.
Mhm.
One was for the 5-year forecast.
Sure.
I thought it suggested that there would be a cutback in proposed overtime for next year.
There definitely will be because we're not expecting the medic unit to operate, so we're not budgeting for that.
So it might be for the minute. I didn't get deep enough to see what was the driver.
Yeah, if you recall the action, the reference, just let me know.
I'll find it.
Josh, given the very wide-ranging nature of the positions on the screen, right? Fire, police, finance, legal. But do we have any sense of the basic cost per employee as an average?
It varies a lot. And I'm happy to bring back an average cost by classification if that's helpful. But it can range from 250,000 to 110,000 depending on the classification. I'm happy to bring that back.
What I'm just trying to get at, and I know that I know the right question to ask, but I would need other people around the table to answer it. Is can we achieve some of the same outcomes by just hiring more people, and instead of paying whatever it might be 1.5 times the cost of a person, pay 1 times the cost of a person by having
Lower salaries.
right.
Right.
And I know that's kind of the obvious question, but those are the kind of questions I think we need to be asking just in case they haven't been run to ground.
Yeah.
Meaning if we're, because I do think it's probably appropriate for the general fund purposes, to back out the reimbursed overtime. So we're at probably 6.5-ish, which is a lot, right? That's half of the deficit almost. Man, if there might be an efficiency by reducing that cost theoretically by 50% by just hiring people whose normal salary covers the cost of doing that work. I get that's a totally oversimplified view, but that might be an area where there could be some significant efficiency found.
Which leads me to second question. Like, first assumption would be the workload would decline, so people would be less stressed, especially sensitive positions as police, fire.
Theoretically,
We don't want them to be too stressed, right? But the second, how much of, how, how much is overtime a retention tool? Because there's probably some people who say, yeah, my salary is X, but I get a lot of overtime, so I have a great job. I'm curious, maybe we don't even know if there's.
If I may, just to speak to the general question. So with our benefit rates and other things, kind of the fully burdened rate for overtime, for a a full-time career staff member, it's very similar to the 1.5 times of paying overtime without having to pay additional benefits, leave, things like that. There's no additional training cost. For the fire department, it's pretty much a 1-for-1. So you have someone call out, you're making up for it with overtime. The burnout and the impact to that person is real, but the financial cost, there's no additional necessarily savings by switching that to a full-time employee.
fascinating, because you're not increasing the benefit
Right.
portion of the cost, you're just increasing the salary cost.
Yeah, so it's definitely a work-life balance challenge, especially for the fire department, when they run massive amounts of overtime. But they take volunteers first, so it's people who are volunteering for that before they have to actually mandatory the overtime. For the police department, they would love to have those people on staff. They just have trouble hiring them. So in that case, it's actually the inability to stay fully staffed that's causing the overtime, not the lack of having the available position authority.
Just for example, last year, the police chief hired 20 new officers. No, he hired 21 new officers and he had 20 retirements. So he ended up one
Net one.
officer ahead.
Yeah.
He netted out one officer. And they never hired 21 people in the history of the police department. That was a record hiring year.
So they're having a hard time finding enough
Mhm.
people to hire for the positions that are open.
Yeah, if you look at the police department now versus 10 years ago, it's not as an appealing position as it was. There's a lot of more scrutiny, a lot more difficulties with those hirings, and frankly, we're losing people. You're eligible to retire, you leave. We used to have people stay for 5 or 10 years after they were eligible, but people are just being done. So I think a former police chief, I saw them fully staffed one time, and the next day they had a retirement. So there's always going to be some churn there, and that's why we have that estimate for vacancy savings. The police department actually does have vacancy savings because the overtime, they don't backfill all their vacant positions. But adding additional position authority would not decrease that overtime. That's just to get them to their minimum staffing requirements.
Gosh, it looks like in 2021, something seems to have shifted because it goes up about a third over time. It's kind of it's holding for a long period of time, and all of a sudden it just jumps, and then it's just kind of stayed on that track of incremental growth. What has changed?
So, speaking anecdotally, we could get an answer from the fire department, but it was a former fire chief. But really what happened is, people weren't able to figure out how to hire during COVID very quickly. So it really was, hey, this is going to be a short-term thing. We're holding hiring for a little bit. We're backfilling with overtime. And then they said, hey, we got to figure this thing out. So they did begin academies again, but there was a period where they were just running short and filling with overtime, which is why you see that bumped up.
Interesting. Yeah, because it looks like it's kind of become the new standard practice going into this new year, given the fact that there's a $1.5 million jump into fiscal year 24.
So if people are going through academies and training and that sort of thing now, couldn't we see that then decrease over time?
Yeah, I think there's other impacts also. So we had paid leave Oregon that went into effect, so people are able to stay out longer. I'm sure all of you are feeling the impact of that also. That's been extremely impactful. State or other state conflagrations. So we provide aid to other states. We do get reimbursed for it. So when we send a team, like they just got back from California, we'll eventually get reimbursed for that team that went, but it does, they're operating on overtime. And then we'll get reimbursed for it. So that's been more prevalent in recent years also. So there's not just one thing that's contributing to it, but I would say the largest is the staffing, and getting fully staffed and just, for the police department, really making some good strides and getting people on board, but losing people at the same rate.
Are there any changes to the collective bargaining agreements that impacted that?
So we were behind market for a little while, for both police and fire. So some of the collective bargainings recently have corrected that, which impacts our bottom line, of course. The labor costs more, but it creates we're within market, so we're not going to lose people to other agencies because we have people leaving, to a smaller agency, less call volume, frankly, less work, for similar pay. So we have to maintain our competitiveness to maintain our employees.
So who sets staffing requirements for fire department? Because you said a lot of overtime is just they don't have a choice.
Yeah,
So
so
whether there's flexibility there on the city side.
yeah, it's a really good question. So there's a couple nuances there, and I'm happy to bring the fire chief back to talk through some of them. But so right now we have 11 fire stations open. We maintain staffing at those 11 fire stations 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And that's the minimum staffing. It's just covering the ground at those different fire stations so they're able to respond to calls.
And that's part of our contract.
Part of our contract is maintaining full staffing for those. Yeah.
Contract with,
The International Firefighters Association, 314.
is that union?
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
And interestingly, I mean, I was trying to digest a lot of that material we got, I only got through a chunk, but there was that, what do we call the portal? Where we have the scorecard.
Yeah, the community reporting.
Community reporting portal. And the lowest scoring item on our scorecard was our response. The thing that really drove it down was our response times. Is that on fire and medic? Or are those kind of one and the same?
So they're one and the same. So either the ambulance provider Falk or the fire department stops the clock, basically. So when they get there, that stops the.
Yeah. So it's just interesting. And I think the metric was something like within 5 minutes or something like that. And we were at a 61% effective rate or response rate, whatever score on that. So it's just interesting that we're incurring a ton of cost in overtime. People are burnt out, and we're not getting. And I don't know. Maybe 5 minutes is the wrong standard. Maybe it should be 10 minutes, and that's more acceptable. So I don't have a comment on why or whether 5 minutes is a good standard or not. But the reality is, if that's our standard, we're not hitting it, and our people are burnt out, and we're spending $6 million in overtime.
So I'll channel my inner fire chief a little bit, which is a little dangerous. So our response time is actually less than the national standard. So the national standard is more aggressive to get there faster, a higher percentage of the time. And we've thought about going to that higher standard, but when we're not meeting the current standard, it's hard to make it worse going to a different standard. And that's just mainly due to call volume growth. So, I mean, and we can send this out, if you just look at call volume growth, it far exceeds our population growth. So it's just more prevalent. We're getting a lot more calls, and with the same staffing. So the 11 companies being on staff, the analysis done to meet the standard would actually be an additional, I think, 10 fire companies, which is a massive amount of firefighters, a massive cost to actually meet the council policy standard for response time. So we're just maintaining the current staffing, but the service level is declining.
And isn't some of that driven by the nature of the call as well? Like the type of call that the fire department is getting these days is not a lot of non-emergent kind of responses that they're required to go to.
Yes, and sometimes, over the last several years, we've stopped responding to some of those, but we're still getting lift assists. We're still getting other calls that we respond to.
But the metric you mentioned is specifically for that high level.
Yeah, the priority one.
Priority one.
Not
Where it's
not
life
a
threat.
lift
Yeah.
assist.
Yeah, exactly. Where it matters, it's like a life and death
Yeah.
with,
Yeah.
the seconds matter.
Yeah.
Not, they're not important. They're
Yeah.
just not as emergent. So
Yeah.
we're gonna divert to a priority one call versus a, lift assist.
Well, maybe we'll put a pin in overtime, but, for the sake of getting through the rest of the items, but, maybe there's some low hanging fruit there. We'll just have to see. It's such a big number. It's hard to not hope there's something we could do about that in terms of our scope of finding efficiencies. But if you guys are okay with moving on from that topic, I'd say let's go back to Bill's letter and maybe go to the third.
Just to
Question.
wrap up, I think we have good opportunity. David is the new fire chief, right?
Yes.
He comes from San Diego, so hopefully he will bring some new ideas to us.
When you look at,
Mostly cost savings.
when you look at call volume, is the call volume in Salem on par with what the national average is, or is it above or below?
That's a good question.
So we had a company come in when we were looking at moving into the medical transport business. AP Triton came in and did a 120-page analysis of our call volume and the staffing that we're going to need to have in order to meet that call volume. And they said that, and I quote, Salem is older and sicker than most communities that we see. And that's reflected in our call volume. And certainly an unhoused and unsheltered population in our community has a disproportionate impact also on that they are high utilizers of our services. And of course, those services are not being reimbursed in any way. When we respond to a medical emergency at your home, you are going to get a bill. You'll get a bill right now from Falk, and in the future, you'll get a bill from the city of Salem or a third-party vendor that's going to bill you or your insurance company $2,400 for that if we transport somebody.
How much of that do you get reimbursed by?
Say that again.
Do you get reimbursed full, 60%, 70%, or?
Oh, like our payer mix?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we bill a lot and we have to write off a great deal. Yeah, our payer mix is,
Like how much?
oh, it's more than half. I have
Okay.
like 70%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would imagine.
Yeah, it's about, I think it was about 24% private party insurance, and then there's Medicaid and Medicare, and then there's uninsured.
And I did include a link to the EMS report in your packet for today, and I'll show you that. You ask what ours is, and we haven't been billing for the full system because Falk has been doing it. We've just billed for the 2 medic units. So we'll have a lot better understanding of the actual metrics when we have the whole thing starting in July. So it's a lot of unknowns there. I mean, the good news is there is something called the Ground Emergency Medical Transport. It's some federal funding that makes up for the difference for what Medicare doesn't pay that we're eligible for that Falk isn't eligible for, which is one of the reasons why financially it works a lot better for us to maintain the service than Falk as a private provider. So that's one benefit. Even with our, I think it's like 70% of Medicare, that doesn't necessarily hurt us because of this other funding stream.
But again, this is all outside of the general fund, right? This is in a segregated fund that is.
It is outside, but it's also important to think about it as a system, and they're definitely referencing one and impacting one another, as is the 911 call center. So if you package all of that together, the fire department in total is by far the city's biggest general fund expense.
Yeah.
Add the EMS and you add the 911 call center, there's over 100 employees, an additional 100 employees there.
Well, this could mushroom into a really big conversation because, Salem Health is hosting these community health forums, and you go to one of those and you just see we've got problems, and we're in an ecosystem, and so the very things that we hear at that forum are impacting how many calls the fire department is getting because of lots of health problems that aren't necessarily my house is on fire.
So question to that. So we have two issues. We have big call volume, which we do not control. What we do control is how many people we have and how much overtime. So I think it's important to separate these two. What we control is their solution. The calls are going to come in and we don't know how quickly we can respond. But what we control is the overtime. So I would probably dive into that to see how can we reduce or eliminate overtime. Do we need those staffing levels? Do we need, I don't know how many firefighters show up at your house when you have an emergency. Do we need all of them to show up? Or not? I don't know. But that's the item that we do control.
So we could spend, I think, several hours on this. I will speak just real briefly to the last one. So we staff our fire engines or fire companies with three.
Okay.
So there's a captain, a driver, and a firefighter medic. The standard is 4. So if you go up to like Tuolumne Valley Fire and Rescue, they staff 4. Hillsborough staffs 4.
So already.
So we're already at a lower level of service, and that's been in place, since I've been here at least.
Since I've been-
Yeah. So kind of that lower staffing level. So
One other
you'd
thing
never
I-
want to go to 2. So.
One other thing I would add to that is that as we bring on EMS, it's going to give us more flexibility in how we respond to calls. We're planning on staffing an ambulance that has only basic EMTs. So you hurt your ankle in your yard, we're not dispatching the big red fire truck and the paramedics for that. We're gonna send the EMTs, they can package you up and transport you to the hospital. So we're gonna have the capacity to be more selective in how we respond to the stream of calls that's coming in. With EMT and our medical transport being part of our service delivery system.
So if we could take a step back from the trenches for a second, and I think it would be helpful for me, especially if I'm going to have to sit in front of the city council and share a message. I'd like to start dialing in on what is it that we're going to present. What I don't want to end up doing is having 4 meetings and having talked through a bunch of stuff, but really not coming to any outcomes. And when I say outcomes in my head, I've been thinking probably the realistic outcome is that we're going to come up with a list of important questions to ask. And I can't imagine really that we're going to have answers, not in essentially a 10 business day period. So I want to take the temperature of this group to see what it's kind of a question I asked, I guess, at the beginning of last meeting. What's the outcome? I'd like to start putting some parameters around that so we can start working toward it. In my mind, it's at least questions, which means I think registering as we come across them, something like, hey, we don't know if in fact there are efficiencies to be found in fire, but what we do know is that we're spending $6 million or whatever the number was on overtime a year, and that number doesn't seem to be going down anytime soon. Is there something that can be done there? Because that's a big number. Now, I also hear some great responses, well, great as in sad, but useful. Yeah, I mean, useful information that is, wow, we already are at 75% of staffing a truck. And we aren't even responding as fast as the lower level of standard suggests, right? So that maybe counters whether or not there is in fact any efficiency to be found. However, going back to my question or desire, I'd like to start maybe having a list of things that we could at least at the end of our last meeting say, okay, we have 25 ideas here. How many of these do we think actually could potentially add to the efficiency of the operations of the city and land on like 10, whatever. I'm just floating that as an idea, but I welcome any other thoughts I just want to make sure we end up with something helpful at the end of our conversations.
I agree with you. I would call them calls for action. Like overtime is definitely call for action. Do we have capacity to fine tune how to reduce it? We don't, but we can at least identify.
Identify it.
And there you go. That's how I see it.
Does that sound like a
Yeah.
good start? And that may evolve as we keep talking, but Hallie, would you mind just kind of keeping a running, I'm sure you are already, but a running list of our questions? And I think, anybody want to take a stab at articulating the one on overtime?
I just have, is there something that can be done to decrease fire overtime?
I think it's overtime as a whole.
Yeah, I don't think it's just
Okay.
fire,
I think
although
because
that's the,
Fire and police are the main.
Yeah, they're the two
They're
big
the
nuggets.
yeah.
there.
They are, but
Yeah.
there's quite a bit of swelling in overtime in a couple different departments kind of sporadically that I think is worth kind of drilling in on.
I think part of the question is just looking at what's the short-term, long-term staffing model that we need, find the efficiencies that we're after as a community.
And I would add to that, so.
is that that's kind of a separate question you're adding, or
I
part of
think
it?
it's a sub-bullet of the overtime is.
Okay.
Hoping it's a sub-bullet of the overtime.
Yeah.
Can we reduce overtime to have trained staff at the appropriate staffing? You talked about different levels of expertise, different levels of pay grade, to get to the services that we're after as a community at the costs that we're after. Sorry,
The
Nestor.
sub-question would be, so we have limitations because of contract with unions. But how about exploring different ways of public-private partnership, like some cities do volunteer firefighters and stuff like that?
And
just
we
to make it-
do, but,
Do we do?
Oh, we do?
We don't have volunteer.
oh, it's the
Yeah.
county.
Okay.
Well, I'll throw one out that's a piggyback on that, which, just trying to find any kind of efficiencies. One of the things I heard on Wednesday was just how much of our rising costs are a function of PERS.
Yes.
And we have it seemingly virtually no control over that. That to me highlights the cost of a public employee. And I can't help but ask, and I know that this is this is going to be a sensitive topic, but I can't help but ask, are there opportunities to reduce the cost of a particular service by privatizing it? And I don't know where to start in terms of answering that question. But if a public employee to deliver this service costs X amount because of something like PERS, I don't do PERS in my business. And I'm guessing in some places that employee is going to cost less. I don't know where we would start on that question, probably with the CFO, but
I could offer just, and this came up with the forecast review team, and it's a question we get all the time, right? Anytime I'm out at a town hall or a meeting, it's like, oh, PERS. Yeah. I think one of the things that's not widely known or communicated, maybe Todd, you're aware, but so the large cost is related to an unfunded liability that's out there. So reducing employees, privatizing employees doesn't get rid of that unfunded liability. It just spreads it out over less employees, so your rates continue to go up. So one of the things that's really important to note is we have tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 3 employees, Oxford employees, those of us who started after 2003, there's very little unfunded liability. So the long-term issue has been solved to an extent. So like new employees coming on are not adding to that unfunded liability. It's employees that are already retired. It's employees who are going to retire in the next 10 years that are contributing to that unfunded liability. And if you privatize a service, you're squeezing that balloon onto fewer employees, so your rate goes up. So it sounds really nice in the short term, and I think it could, if you were looking at some very isolated incidents, but if you were to say, okay, we're going to eliminate 50 employees and privatize it, that the cost doesn't go away. It just gets spread out over fewer employees. So just
Especially if you
one,
happen to be getting rid of tier 3 employees. You might not have anything.
Right.
yeah. So just one caution, it might not have the impact you think it will. It might, we get 2 years of PERS rates at a time. So you might have savings for 2 years. The actuaries relook at our rates, they adjust, they look at our payroll growth. They say, hey, it's going way down because of the employees are less, so they spread that unfunded liability over those fewer employees.
And do they do that on an organization by organization basis, that actuarial work?
So for us, we're an independent employee, so they do.
Yeah.
Like all school districts are pooled together, state agencies are pooled together, so it's a little nuanced, but we're an independent employee, so our activity is ours. Our unfunded liability is ours. And it's not gonna go away.
And our rates can't go down until we reach 90% funded status. So
What's that currently?
Yeah, where's it at?
70-ish.
Yeah, it's
I-
around
I think
there.
it's around that, yeah.
I think it dropped below 70 a few years ago. That kind of, but then they put some,
Catch-up contributions. And
Yeah, so there's a
Yeah.
collared system where it like triggers higher increase rates, but no one was really expecting this latest rate increase, where we saw, 30% increase in PERS rates. But we don't expect them to go down, and I don't disagree that public employees are expensive, but brand new employees that you bring on, the benefit that we pay is still somewhat high, but the normal cost, is fully funded, and that's at a lower percentage.
so a couple of thoughts. So really well stated and kind of good overview of hers, because it is complicated. But if you think about the incremental cost, what's that benefit load going to? So if we were to go out and hire a bunch of tier 1 people who probably don't want to do fire and police at this point, that'd be much more expensive incrementally. If we hired OgServe, which is since 2002, I think you mentioned it.
2003
or 3, thank you. Their benefit load, what's that benefit load for PERS and benefits versus a privatized benefit load with a 401k and other those costs? I think that benefit load would be interesting and to say versus a private, but I think it's much smaller than what we might traditionally think of the tier 1 benefit. The tier 1 benefit was a rich benefit that, as Joshua said, has been solved. They went to tier 2 and then they went to the OgServe. So it's a long-term path to get there until everybody flushes through the system and the UAL gets paid off, which by collaring it has delayed getting that UAL paid off.
What's the UAL?
So,
unfunded actuarial liability.
sorry. So
That's
we're,
the
Their
one.
projection of
Forgive
when
my
that thing
ignorance.
can Start.
2037.
I used an acronym. I shouldn't have used the acronym. So we're about 70% funded as PERS. So as taxpayers, we know we have a hole there on the benefits that have been promised. If we get to 90%, then we can have more flexibility. But because they've lowered the size of the increases or attempted to lower the size of the increases, that's pushed out how long it takes us. So we're talking about like 2036, 2038 before we get there.
Yeah,
We have
2037, I think.
It's like you guys have had these questions before.
We have
we have a 10-year
Very, very quick.
Yeah,
we have a 10-year weight on our shoulders to get caught up, but we've been slowing down that weight because we didn't want to increase the impact on schools and cities with bigger increases. But this increase that starts on July 1st was a surprise to many. A lot of that has to do with the investment expectations.
Yeah.
And they have investment expectations. They've been ratcheting it down.
8% is minimum, right?
It's now
6.9.
6.9.
Okay.
They've been ratcheting it down from the 8% that they were getting in the 90s. So hopefully that does get better investment returns, and then we can get the UAL paid off. But it's the incremental piece. We're probably hiring OgServe or tier 3, as you described. Is that incremental value? There's probably not a lot, but I don't know your benefit load for your OgServes versus what we think a private industry could get. So there could be an efficiency there to privatize. It just, if you look back at the 70s, there was probably a bigger gap, or 80s prior to then going away from tier 1. But I think it still could be an opportunity to look at and say, could we find savings by privatizing? It just may not be as big as what we traditionally might, but there still might be an efficiency there.
Yeah,
The
so
way I'm thinking here, all valid, what is said. But we have overtime problem. So I think when you say privatizing, doesn't mean replacing current people with private companies or whatever. But I'm thinking, for example, instead of paying overtime police officer, can we pay security guard to bridge that gap? And it's outside companies paid for service. in firefighting, and this is very globalized, like I know I work with some companies who do firefighting helicopters and so forth. They get paid when they fight fires. Can we have some kind of that concept? And I'm just thinking out loud, right?
Mhm.
Even private fire company that pays per service. So I do think there's opportunities in terms of overtime, not replacing our people here. But in terms of shaving off overtime by utilizing different.
And not to appear defensive, but
No, it's good.
so, I mean-
Rigorous debate, right?
my immediate, I jumped to collective bargaining, right? So we can't backfill, union positions with private positions automatically, right? Those have to be negotiated with the union. We couldn't say, hey, we're not gonna have firefighters, we're gonna have a firefighter company on contract. That would have to be negotiated. And, 80% of our calls are medical. They're not actually, fighting fires. So, but yeah, I think it's definitely a thing, something we could look at, alternate service delivery.
And I know you are doing with already private security.
Yeah.
Backfills police.
So,
We have private security here on our campus, for example. That's a contract that we have with a security agency, but they're not backfilling the police
They're not.
in any way.
it's a different level of service. So we have private security for the Civic Center campus, for the municipal court, and for our downtown parkades. That used to be, we used to fund a couple of police officers with that, but they were diverted to 911 calls. So,
Yeah.
so we just have, a security company that's driving around.
And do they report to the chief, the security, private security? people?
No,
No,
They
it's
don't.
a contract. So the department manages the contract, urban development.
I think there's one other aspect of this sort of efficiency, whether it's employees, is from a technological perspective. There are definitely opportunities there as we move into this world of artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's opportunities there for greater efficiencies, and that's something that we are just beginning to explore and understand what the opportunities are there. But when I think about our growth in an employee population, I think more about our growth in technology investment than in more payroll. That's where I think you'll see that efficiency is in allowing our employees, our existing employees, to do more and to extend their reach, as opposed to maybe reducing our workforce necessarily, but extending our existing employees.
Since I think we're kind of popcorning around on some of this, I have two questions I wanted to kind of dive into. But one was about IT. I think it's relevant to what we're talking about. Year over year, it looks like you guys are in the general fund budgeting a $2 million increase in IT, which appears to be quite a jump from prior years. Curious what is happening in IT.
Which one are you looking at? For
It's
what?
the final budget expenditure appropriations that is kind of published. It's this document. I just found it on this is for last year, and this is for current.
So some of that has to do with enterprise services and some of their consolidation, but there hasn't been a $2 million increase just for IT services.
I mean, there were a few positions added because we're going through, we're getting ready to embark on an exciting project, a new enterprise resource planning system. And so those, there were 3 positions that were added, and those positions will be, they have a revenue source attached to them. So the expense went up, but the revenue did as well. And that chart only shows the expenditures.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just curious because, yeah, it looks like the jump's right at $2 million, which seems fairly significant. And it's a significant line item anyways, because it's like $15 million, is what's 15.6 million.
So if we can bring you back, because there were some reorgs there, so some positions moved from other areas into IT.
I mean, another thing is we've seen, we were expecting to see software renewal increases that were substantial. I mean, we called that out in the last forecast. It was over $1 million, I think, 1.5 if I'm remembering correctly. So that could be another
Driver.
driver.
So inside of IT, in the conversation of privatization, what is that? And again, maybe this is a whole can of worms we need to dive into because it is a big item outside of fire and police. I'm curious, how much of that staffing? How much of that is stuff that could be potentially privatized or contracted with? And then how much of that is like hard costs, like infrastructure, software services, things like that?
Yeah.
So we can bring that back at the category level for sure.
But that's also in the budget.
Yeah.
But I can send you the page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I could find it. Yeah, that's true. And then my other kind of question I was just trying to kind of wanted to wrap trail into, we've been talking a lot about staffing. So I see it's, you guys kind of figure it's like employees per 1,000. Is that right? That's kind of
It's a metric. Sure.
yeah. So how do you know if you've got the right total amount of staffing across the?
So one of the links I sent you was a link to an efficiency webpage. On there,
Yeah.
there's like an internal benchmarking study that Moss Adams did for us, comparing us to some other cities. In there, it's really hard to get apples to apples because I think what you just said is, some cities maintain staff, others contract for things, so it's really hard to get staffing numbers / expenditures matching those up. But that attempted to that study for internal services. For external services, we can compare ourselves to other cities. There's some best practices out there. For example, the police department really uses that, sworn employees per 1,000 as a reference compared to other cities as their benchmark. But there's not always a one-to-one comparison.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that
I
something
think
you came today to ready to talk about? Because that was a question that was asked by a few people last time, just what are our benchmarks to be able to see how we're doing? Is that something you're prepared to talk about?
We certainly can. I know that we have some limited time left. I did provide some links to some of the various, like the staffing analysis for the police department. The fire department has their updated standards of cover. So individual department looks at staffing needs. We're happy to walk through that, or you guys could look at it in between now and the next meeting. We could come back and talk about it then, or whatever.
Okay.
Whatever your preference is.
Let's
Where were those links?
The one.
To the budget, financial report, 5-year forecast.
So it was in the additions agenda today, included in the packet. Under that question, we haven't quite gotten there yet, but the
Oh, God, so it's.
question
links in
4,
this-
yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
When you talk about personnel management, I'm just curious, are a number of the state employees or city employees working remotely or telecommuting, or is everyone pretty much back in office?
So we have some fully remote employees, largely in IT. The balance, there's some hybrid work going on, a couple days work from home or in the office. And then we have a large chunk of people that were never working from home and are still not working from home. Police, fire, parks, they're out in the field. Yeah, so it varies by department.
But the vast majority are not fully remote.
The vast majority just aren't remote at all.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Then there's some that are hybrid, and some that are a few that are fully remote.
Josh, would you mind just giving a quick response? And this isn't so much just because somebody submitted a comment and we have to respond to everything that they say, but this somebody is somebody who's on the budget committee. So I think their questions come from a place of a lot of information. I'd like to hear just your thoughts on the last two of Bill's items there.
Yeah, so the next question really talks about like tax exemption programs, tax abatement, or multi-unit housing incentive. So some of those are where the city council is making the policy decision. In order to get affordable housing, in order to get the economic development, we're going to forego taxes for a certain period of time. Affordable housing generally is a much longer time frame, 20, 30 years. The economic abatements, either the state program or our own program, are usually 3, 5, 10 years. Which really, that's how we got the Amazon distribution center, by offering those tax abatements. So it's the reason that like the Mill Creek URA is going to come back on the tax rolls at such a high level. So it's the economic development pieces are more kind of that short-term loss. You lose some tax increment for that long-term gain of getting, a large piece of property on the tax rolls.
And several of those properties that do have existing tax abatements are in urban renewal areas, so it wouldn't impact the general fund either way immediately, right? Until that
All of
property.
them are in urban renewal areas.
Yeah, not quite all
Not
of
all of
them.
them,
Yeah, that was our assumption as well. We got the list, so
Okay.
we can provide it.
Yeah, we can definitely send out more information about that.
And then the affordable housing, I think, is a little bit of a trickier question, right? Because we definitely need affordable housing. It's one of our major goals. But we do, get a lot more city residents in housing, but we don't get any revenue to actually provide services for. So that's definitely a policy question for
That
city
was the
council.
point you kind of made last time, wasn't it? That the cost of the additional services is exceeding the benefit of the coming off of the property
Well,
taxes.
I mean, that's even for properties that are paying taxes. This
Yeah.
is often, they're not paying any property taxes for services, but we're having more affordable housing.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a balance there. We'll provide the list. We just got an updated list from Urban Development of all the properties that are under one of those tax abatement programs, and we can get it out to you guys. But I don't disagree with Member Nixon that it's impactful. But it's also a tension with balancing our needs for affordable housing and economic development.
Hey, Josh, can you click on the? And I wonder how much these incentives even worked. I mean, are they significant enough that somebody would say, I'm changing my mind from not building to building?
Yes,
Yes.
Is it significant enough?
yes, absolutely.
I can-
Especially right
Absolutely,
now,
yeah.
they are.
I can answer that.
Yeah.
That-
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Brilliant.
It will, maybe, I don't know, maybe not 10, 15 years ago, but at least where the economy has been in the last 5 years, without such programs, the housing is not going to be built,
Because of interest rate environment.
and construction costs.
The Rivenwood project, that's in the urban renewal area, downtown riverfront.
That's the
urban
North
renewal
Star
area.
one, right?
Yeah.
The North Star.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Correct. That also got a multi-unit tax exemption for 10 years. They would not have done that project. It just simply would not have penciled without that incentive. And
Now,
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer this question, and I don't know that anybody does. Well, probably somebody would be happy to take money to try to answer it, but is the economic benefit worth the cost? And that's not a simple, because there's we'll call it the non-economic benefit, which those are not going to be easily separated. But of course, providing affordable housing is a very worthwhile thing and good for our community. Ultimately, we probably would want to try to say why. Well, why does that matter? Well, because we want a thriving, healthy community where people can afford to live. If they can't afford to live here, what's the cost of that, right? And that has somewhere out there, there's a number associated with that. I have no idea how to do that, but it would be interesting if it were possible to try to say, yeah, it costs us this much in property tax increment to do that, but the benefit was this. And I don't know, I mean, we can say that 100% those affordable housing units are not being built without those incentive programs. The next question though is, okay, is that worth it?
Right.
And I don't know how to answer that question.
And are we building on Temkin villages,
Sure.
Temkin
Like,
villages?
great, we provided, and I'm not saying this is my opinion,
Yeah,
but I'm saying theoretically, great, we provided a bunch of affordable housing, but we dug ourselves a massive hole in the process.
Right.
I don't know if that's something we want to, we're clearly not going to tackle that problem in this group, but I guess Callie put it down as a possible question. If there's people out there that know how to answer it. But it's a lot bigger than this committee.
It's not something we're gonna answer next week. I
No,
guarantee
no,
that.
no, no. No, I'm saying, and remember, I'm thinking about what am I saying in front of the city council in 2 weeks or whenever I'm going to be in front of them. And it's not going to be a bunch of answers. It's going to be a bunch of questions that we're suggesting have some possibility of creating efficiency. All right, what about the last one, Josh?
The last one is an interesting question. So the Transportation Services Fund is in a similar position as the general fund. It relies on state highway revenue. If you have a chance, you go back to the January 15th Budget Committee meeting. At the end, there was a very detailed presentation on the status. So I'm not going to belabor it here. But would it be more efficient to pause the construction of new streets and sidewalks until revenue can be brought more in line with operating costs? It's a really interesting question. I think we're already out of line even without the new streets, and new streets are coming on at a good position generally. So when developers build them or we build them with SDCs or bonds, they're getting put in a good position. So there's a long-term deferred maintenance cost out there, but I think pausing would actually, pause development, reduce property tax revenue, reduce growth, and overall cause a few more issues. So I don't disagree with the spirit of the question, but I'm not sure it's quite the right answer.
Not seeing opportunity.
Yeah. Are there other things when you think about the scope of the city that could be paused?
I mean, that could be a really big question. You have a thought or an example?
Purchasing fleet vehicles.
So we did. So if you look at the additions agenda, we paused fleet replacement, except for the police department for the current fiscal year in the general fund. We're likely going to recommend, and we're going to recommend probably doing it again, except for the police department. Just stretching the current fleet out a little bit further for the general fund. There's some risks and maintenance costs that come with that, right? But it's certainly something we're looking at.
Because the spirit of that question is until basically revenue can be brought more in line with operational costs. My kind of broad concern in thinking about all this is there really a day when that revenue is actually going to and that's outside of our scope of revenue, but it assumes that at some day there will be enough revenue to be like, oh, let's go back and do the streets. And I don't really feel like there's a plan for more revenue that's super clear.
So streets are a little bit different, right? Because a lot of the improvements are funded with general obligation bonds. So we're doing quite a bit of work there, over the next 10 years. And, I'm hoping after that authorization expires, we're able to try it again and show some success there. So it's a little different for that funding source specifically.
Okay.
And to follow up on that, so I noticed the red light cameras brought in 1.7 million versus 1.2 million last year, so 40% increase. And I heard.
We need people to run more red lights.
So we need to incentivize.
No, we don't, because that'll increase. the number of-
No.
Oh, that's right. There you go.
But this is very serious.
Sorry, bad idea.
So I also heard that Salem Police, which I was very glad, is now empower all cops to be traffic cops too, which I think we need rule of law coming to the streets of Salem. How much revenue will that bring? Because I know it will bring revenue. If you walk around, everybody's driving texting, everybody's speeding. So I think that's significant revenue potential and benefit for community because rule of law will come back to the streets of Salem.
So we don't put quotas on traffic
course,
citations.
yeah.
We don't put up red light cameras for revenue generation. In a lot of cases, they actually cost us money if they're, because we have to share that with the state and the county, and then we have to adjudicate the ticket. Shockingly, tons of people, when you get a photo red light, you can click on it, see the video, they still want to come to court. and talk to a judge about it. I'm not quite sure why, because they look at the video and
There you are.
there you are.
So clear.
Um, So we look at those pieces as enforcement mechanisms, not revenue generators.
But
With
it's
that,
bringing money.
with that being said, I mean, the police department is exploring, additional approaches that we could add to the system. But it's really making sure the enforcement mechanism in place and there's enough activity that even makes sense. But it is a very successful program. It does see behavior change, so there's less accidents after they're in place than there were before.
And it will bring down 911 calls for ambulance,
Yeah.
I think the benefit is tremendous, so I'm all in favor, at the risk of sounding too policing. Policing.
Yeah.
Almost the police state.
That's the police state.
We have 20 minutes. Josh, I'd like to see, if there's anything in particular you had that you felt like we could be particularly responsive to some of the questions that came up last meeting. I know there's probably not enough time for you to cover everything, but is there some low hanging fruit?
Yeah, if I may, I found a presentation I did quite a few years ago, but it's still relevant on the support service charge, the cost allocation. So how we allocate IT, finance, city manager, across the other funds. So if that's something we could look at just really quickly, I feel like that's a big chunk of the general fund that's not public safety, just to give some more information there. And then probably, if I may, I think if you go through those questions and there's something you want to focus on at the next meeting, maybe just let us know and we can make sure we spend some time on it, if that works.
Everybody feel good about that approach for a time?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I will note, this is something I put together in 2017. So some of the numbers are quite a bit older, but still relevant. And I thought about updating it and then I just didn't have time. So indirect costs, any cost that's not specifically identified with a particular cost objective. So it's not a fire department cost, it's indirect, it's overhead, as you might call it. And the cost allocation is assigning those costs to a particular program. Internal creates a method for other funds to pay for general fund support services. So all the 24 other funds in the city need to pay their fair share of that overhead costs. It also serves as a basis for when we charge grants, for federal grants specifically, or those with ODOT. We're able to add that indirect cost as part of that basis. This is a little bit older, but as you can see, the support service as the overall city budget is relatively small. So this is the effort to take those costs for those various services and allocate across the balance of the departments. These are the support service groups: mayor and city council, city manager's office, HR, legal, finance and purchasing, facilities, IT, and non-departmental. So in 2017, it was 23.7. That's increased a little bit, but it's still relevant. And this is a lot of detail, but I know the forecast review kind of latched onto this also, that team. So I thought it was worth kind of walking through. So mayor and city council, it's, our city council and mayor are not paid, so it's a relatively small cost there. But the general council costs are allocated across citywide, based on the number of a council agenda items. So basically, by department, by fund, if you have an agenda item, we're going to charge you a portion of that cost based on that. The hearings officer is charged directly to planning. So basically the general fund just eats that cost. And then the financial audit is part of the mayor and council budget because they authorize it, they manage that program. And it's charged out based on transaction activity across the city. So it's a combination of things, but it's basically if you have financial activity, if you have projects, if you have other things going on, you're going to get a share of that cost. City manager's office. So this is Keith and his team. It's allocated on a blended rate between number of employees by area and actual expenses. So there's some areas like our benefits fund, where it's a large amount of actual expenses but very few employees. So we try to balance those things out with a blended rate between employees and actual expenses. Budget preparation. In 2017, the budget office was part of the city manager's office. This is a little old, but still valid for finance, and we allocate it based on actual expenses. Similar so franchise administration lives in finance right now. So we have a franchise administrator. We allocate that to general fund services because that revenue goes into the general fund. It's not allocated out to other services. Public information is charged out to all funds. There's a benefit there. And then legislative services. So we have lobbying efforts, both on the state and federal side. They're allocated out to all departments because everyone can access that service. I will say we take that out when we go for grant reimbursement because it's ineligible, that kind of lobbying efforts. Human resources. This one's pretty basic, charged by a citywide employee count. With some direct allocation. So at this point, like fleet and facilities were part of HR. So that was a direct allocation for that overhead piece. Legal, they actually do somewhat of a time study based on where they spend their time. So this is an area where we see quite a bit of fluctuation depending on activity with various departments. Prosecution, so we maintain our prosecutors here with the city. That work at the municipal court, and they're just a cost of doing business. We don't allocate that cost out to anywhere else. And then the recorder, similar to the mayor and council, is charged out based on council agenda items. Finance and purchasing. Purchasing, we allocate based on actual purchase orders over. It's actually $5,000 now. Because that's when purchasing actually gets involved. If it's under that amount, it's more of a department process. Over 5,000 purchasing gets involved. So it's allocated citywide by just how many purchase orders were issued over $5,000. Financial operations, so this accounting, accounts receivable, accounts payable, things like that, just gets allocated based on that transaction activity. And then some direct allocations. So finance does some specific analysis for the utility or benefits, so we can track those for the project and charge them directly. Facilities, civic center maintenance. So there's quite a few employees that work here at this building. It gets allocated based on square footage of usage by departments. Direct projects, so we, similar to probably some of your organizations, we have projects people track on their time cards. So if there's a roof replacement or managing, a specific contract, they'll charge that directly to that project, and we'll just pass that on to the benefiting department. And then for facilities and some other areas, there's sometimes just overhead, for facilities. So that's allocated based on those specific project costs. So there's a percentage of just facilities overhead. IT, there's a specific tracking for our financial information management system. That's FIMS, sorry for the shorthand, but our Oracle programmers, database managers, things like that. So that gets allocated based on that same transaction activity. IT operations, they have a ticketing system. They track where they're spending time, so we allocate those costs. And then direct allocations, if they're doing a project implementation for the utility or WBCC or somewhere else, they'll track that and we'll charge it. So there's some pretty wide fluctuations for IT, depending on who they're doing work for. And this matters for us. We don't put quotas on it, but if they're doing a project for the police department, there's no revenue coming back to the general fund for that. But if they're doing it for the utility or building and safety, there's revenue coming back. So there can be some fluctuations. Non-departmental. So depending on what it is, we have some citywide membership type things that get charged here, some infrastructure costs. So if it's applicable, we'll charge it citywide across for actual expenses, or it's a direct allocation. Or in some cases, it's like if we do a grant out of non-departmental, we're not going to allocate it anywhere. That's just a cost of the general fund. This is more detail than you want, just, you know, we work with departments, so we publish a draft and they can, I wouldn't say appeal, but, we can have a discussion about, you know, what was that project? Was that really my project? You know, why is this cost going up or down? This is just by fund. And I'm not gonna actually go to the allocation method, but we use kind of a waterfall method, so we allocate support service charges to all the departments, including the support service departments, and then we do a second allocation for that balance back out to the benefiting departments. It's not uncommon for what other cities do. We've had it in-house since sometime in the 2000s, I think, probably. We had a consultant that did it prior. And I'm happy to report we were using this, I think, MS-DOS based program for quite a while. We just moved it really recently into our budget software, so it's a lot more manageable. I'm happy to answer any questions, but it is a pretty complex, nuanced process we go through every year to allocate those costs. And then it's you know, we work with, especially where there's external stakeholders, like the WVCC, the dispatch center, you know, 29 agencies. If they see a big increase, it's something we usually have to go and talk about, you know, dig into the project reports about where did this come from. So there is quite a bit of rigor that goes into it.
How does that flow through the budget?
Yeah, so it flows a lot better now with it being part of the budget software, because it actually puts the dollar amount in each department's budget. So like for the 2026 budget that's being built currently, it's based on 2024 actuals. And then it's being allocated. So we see the revenue component being put in non-departmental as allocated overhead, and the expense associated with each fund being automatically placed in those cost centers. So there's a 2-year lag just to make sure we're talking about actual expenses.
So for example, just for illustrations, so like your salary, does that get booked as a salary expense in the general fund and then get allocated out and then come back as like an intra-fund transfer?
For that allocated overhead, it comes back as a revenue 2 years later. Yeah, you're exactly right. So our software, and we might make different choices when we migrate to a new system. It doesn't have an ability to split people out by different departments. So you'll see a lot of, you know, we don't like double budgeting, but sometimes it's necessary. So you'll see a lot of movement around different funds for services offered across. So this is another mechanism where you are basically paying for that service twice, once in the general fund, and then again for the receiving department as an expense.
And then it all gets eliminated, obviously, when rolled up. So explain the 2-year lag. I understand conceptually why you have to do that, but like if someone is, you know, presumably making more 2 years later, are you not allocating their entire current salary out then?
Yeah, I mean, that's one downside is, right, you have kind of this implicit cash flow deficit, right? Because costs increase over those 2 years, but you're covering the actual costs from 2 years prior. So you're right, there isn't a direct, you know, so employee A, you know, they might be making $100,000. 2 years ago, they might have been, you know, 92 or something, right? You're covering the 92, not the 100. And there are some cities try to, you know, do some kind of real time. You know, they develop ratios and charge in real time. They can get, you know, it's already fairly convoluted, and that can make it a little bit more convoluted because you would have to do some kind of true up.
Is there an estimate of what you think the difference would be?
Let me pull some numbers. I can tell you actually what the difference is between the support service costs and how much we actually recovered. I can do a few year look back for that.
That'd be helpful.
So these allocations are all within the general fund, correct?
We're allocating support service costs out to the other funds, but we
Okay. How much of it is allocated within the general fund versus?
about 40%, and that can vary. But so like if we charge costs to police and fire, we allocate it, we recognize it, but we don't actually charge it because it would just be kind of the
Right, okay, that's what I
circular.
was wondering.
Yeah, we're not gonna do that.
Okay, so approximately 60% of that 23 million is allocated to non-general fund.
Correct. And I can give you the update that
Yeah, okay.
we're projecting for 2026.
That's close.
Because this is 2017.
So all IT services are in-house, right?
With the exception of sometimes we hire outside help for like software implementations. Yeah, a lot of it is in-house. Like all our help desk support, all our project management.
I wonder, now IT is becoming more and more complex. Has there been study done to see if you third party it, would it be cost efficient and probably safer? I know a lot of organizations outsources because simply we are losing the battle with the technology. Keeping it up.
So it's a good question. We can have our IT folks come and talk. I
Los
will,
Adams is doing one right now.
Ross Adams, one of
Yeah.
the performance assessments they're doing is on IT.
See that. Okay.
To basically an assessment of overall IT services. Some of it's happening kind of organically, like the new ERP system we've selected is cloud-based. That's going to remove some of the
You get
cities.
all the support.
Yeah, so it's going to remove the need for the infrastructure to be on site with the city. You know, so some of that is just going to happen no matter what. So, yeah, we can bring that back.
We're approaching the end of our time. Is there anything that somebody had hoped we really had hit today that we haven't? I'm not suggesting that our job is done, but before we adjourn, I'm just trying to see if there's something in particular that you'd really hoped we were going to cover that we didn't.
I was hoping for $13 million. But I haven't.
Sorry, we didn't.
Key Bank should make.
Maybe Key
recommendations.
Bank could take care of that.
Foundation.
Yeah, Josh, can I get a clarification on your answer to about filling open positions? So when somebody leaves, do we explicitly question the need to open a new position to replace that person with somebody at the same title each time?
So we don't have a centralized process for that. Departments do it internally. But no, we don't have some central, some other cities I'm familiar with have hey, before you can recruit, it has to go to this committee or something, but we don't have a committee, but they're evaluated internally.
Okay, yeah, because we like in our company, when somebody leaves, we ask, do we really need this to hire somebody to replace this person, or can the work be distributed, or hire a lower level employee to take that role?
And I will say a lot of times what we find is, we have a lot of long tenured employees that have been here for 20 plus years. What we find is they're actually doing probably 2 FTE of work or more. So realistically, to spread out that workload, you have to hire a couple more people, which clearly isn't our reality. But that's anecdotally more what we find is that the burden is already too much for one employee. So sometimes it's a challenge to hire for the full scope of what long tenured employees are doing.
I mean, while there's not a formalized process, I know departments do go through a level of analysis, and I mean, many times it's like, oh, well, we had this position, but our need is over here, so let's get it reclassified to meet the new need kind of thing. And like Josh was saying, just long tenured employees, yeah, they're doing a lot more than 1 FTE of work, just with their knowledge and experience, and go creep over time, taking on new tasks.
And we do have a formal process for reclassification. So whether you're asking for a lower classification or a higher classification, it goes to Keith, myself, and our deputy city manager for review. And sometimes the answer is no. No, you can't raise that classification to a higher classification. We need a higher for the current level.
And it's not always a higher classification.
Yeah,
It can go
sometimes
down
it's
to,
lower.
yeah.
Does that answer your question, Eric?
Yeah, I think so. I was just wondering, is there incentive for the departments to get by with less, to say, actually, I found I don't have to backfill this.
Hard to incentivize city government.
It is. I mean,
Yeah, I
so,
have the same question too.
So unfortunately, I mean, the conversation is, hey, I feel like I don't need this position. You know, can I have this in materials and services dollars? And what I usually say is no, but thank you for the savings. And so unfortunately, it goes the other direction. So it's really, really hard to incentivize that type of effort because people want to hang on to positions, especially in the general fund. Other departments, it's a lot easier to reduce and restructure and move around.
Just taking that same line of thinking one step farther back, have you had this kind of a process with your department heads? Like, we need 3% of general fund costs from your departments. What's the best way to do that with minimal impact to city services?
Yeah, so we have that or a similar conversation every year, basically with budget development. It's what we're talking about right now, actually. Usually it's more than 3%, you know, but certainly, but usually it's, you know, external services with a significant community impact. It's really, there's some things that have stayed on the list for a very long time. But usually it's, well, we're just reducing the level of service, you know, less police officers, less code enforcement, less in general.
I mean, that's the challenge, right? With our costs for personnel being the biggest portion of our budget, not impacting services while still reducing is, how do you do that?
Yeah.
Well, that's, I mean, quite frankly, that's what the city's been trying to do since the 90s. I mean, if you go back and look at budgets that have been adopted, you know, hey, we have X deficit, we're going to reduce this service, that service. You know, we don't see aquatics, you know, our recreation's down to 5 staff, you know, so there's not much room because it's already been eliminated.
When you allocate your expenses, are you allocating everything, including like things down to office supplies, or is it just personal?
Yeah, it's everything. And the full functional cost.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brent.
Well, we're out of time. So I'll just say before we adjourn, if there is something that you'd really hoped we would have heard today, please send an email to Josh and let him know what you're hoping for. And also just say, to the extent that you have any suggestions on how to make our time together more efficient, please let me know. I'm not pretending to know exactly how to do this. So welcome any feedback on what we can do to make our time better used. But with that, I think we'll adjourn.